as I said at the beginning, my name is Sarah Danzel. I lead communications here at Agreed, and I'm so thankful for you all for making the time this morning. We literally could not be more excited. Have been wanting to work with Dr. Britt for probably years now. I feel like it's been trying to get her into our speaking circuit, not only as someone that's just so well known in the industry, but really a true thought leader. And as many of you know, right now there's such a push for valuing learning and tying it into the broader organization. So that is what Dr. Britt Andreatta is going to talk to us about today. Couple quick administrative things. Please continue to put in where you're from in the chat. There's two options. We have a group chat there along the bottom as well as a Q&A. We are going to save time at the end for Q&A, so please go ahead and start submitting them now. But along the bottom, feel free to interact with each other through the group chat, submit questions to us. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to jump in. There will be a recording of this afterwards. The Degree team will reach out with that. And with that, again, if there's any questions, let me know, but I will hand it over to Dr. Britt. Britt, thank you so much for being with us. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, Sarah, and to talk to all of you out there in the world who are signed up for this webinar. Good morning. I'm in Santa Barbara, California, and we're having a heat wave right now. So I'm glad that we're starting early so that I'm not too toasty yet. All right, some of you know a little bit about me, but just here's a quick bio. I was the Chief Learning Officer at lynda.com, which is now LinkedIn Learning, for a long time. And I have several courses on that platform that I'm astounded to find out have now got 9 million views. But where I really put my focus these days is I do a lot of research on the brain science of success. So I have 3 books out now that have to do with how our brain works with different things. So Wired to Connect just came out. It's about the brain science of teams and collaboration and inclusion. Wired to Resist is about the brain science of change and why we literally resist it, particularly organizational change. And Wired to Grow is all about the brain science of learning. So I'm not going to talk too much about brain science today, but if you like that kind of stuff, look up my work and I think you'll find some interesting things. So today we're going to talk about how to make talent a C-suite issue, right? You know, if executives start to understand some of the issues that we're dealing with, then we can work with them in a much more collaborative and aligned way. And so what I want to do today is give you 3 tools or 3 strategies that are going to help you do this. And they fall into these buckets. We're going to give you some skills about how you can predict issues in your organization. I'm going to give you some of my tips for consulting for impact, and show you how to better demonstrate value. I know you're probably doing some of these things already, but I'm hoping to give you a few more tools in your toolkit that will make you a little better or more impactful in all of them. And these are all tools that I use. I consult with organizations all the time. All of these tools I have used in the room with executives of all kind of stature and ego, and I have found them to be really, really valuable. So we're going to dive right into our first one, which is predicting issues. If you can get good at seeing what's coming in your organization before the C-suite does, you will find yourself a valued member that's invited to have a seat at the table, and you'll be often tapped for providing insight or input. So, you know, predicting issues seems like kind of a scary thing, but I have found that there's one tool that has literally given me a crystal ball, and I use it all the time, and it has never failed me. And some of you, if you've seen a couple of my talks, have probably heard about this before, but I'm going to give us another dive into it so we all have this information. And this is the work of Dr. Larry Greiner. He was a professor at USC's Marshall School of Business. He has sadly passed, so he's no longer contributing to the field. But during his lifetime, what he studied was organizations of all kinds, of all sizes, and across all kinds of industries. Because he had the question, you know, do they all grow in the same way? What happens as organizations grow and develop? And what he found was there was an amazing pattern that pretty much every organization follows. And it can be mapped along these 2 axes. So he found that one axis is just how old the organization is, whether it's months or years or decades, you know, how long has it been in existence? And then the other axis is how big it is. And that's essentially head count. How many people are you adding to the organization? And over the course of his research, he found that orgs went through 6 pretty predictable phases. Now, this diagram makes those phases look like they're all the same length of time, which is not the case. So this is for pretty appearances only, but it is linear. They do go through them in this order. So I want to walk you through all of them. And in his research, he found what pushed an organization from one phase to another is this thing called evolution. So when an org is doing well, it's going to be kind of in the middle of that phase, and it's going to be doing fine. It's going to be operating smoothly. But essentially, as it keeps adding people, it starts to strain its current setup. And so that's going to lead to this, he called them crisis points or pain points. I like to call them opportunities for transformation. But essentially, it's the pain point that must get resolved. And in the resolution of that pain point, that's what shoves you into the next phase. So if you're having crisis points in your organization, the good news is you're normal. It's normal for these things to happen. And what I love about the Griner curve is now you don't ever have to be surprised about what's coming. And so each phase then has one of these pain points, and these pain points are what shove you into the next phase. So what I want to do now is give you a deeper dive into each of these phases. And you'll also notice that we uploaded into the webinar system 2 documents for you. One is a detailed handout of the Griner curve, and the other one is some organizational consulting questions I love to ask. So if you haven't yet found those on the platform, take a look, but they're there for you to download. So phase 1, this is considered growth through creativity, and this is really where the organization is small and it's being launched by the founders, right? So what's happening here is that you've got just a handful of people and they're wearing many hats. So as a result, communication is spontaneous and informal. And this happens for a while, right? People stay in this startup mode for a while. But as the organization grows and gets more successful, what happens is you get to the crisis point of leadership. And what this means is that you need to start bringing in professional management to where, and by the way, at this point, none of us talent pros are in the mix. It's just really the core elements of the business. They haven't probably thought about bringing in HR or talent or L&D yet. But once they hit this crisis point, they realize, oh, we've gotten big enough that we need to have kind of professional management or function specialists come in and lead the various portion. So this is typically where someone gets hired who's going to lead the sales function, and they've got extensive sales experience, and someone's going to lead the engineering function. And usually somewhere in here, they're probably still outsourcing it, but they start to have someone at least deal with the basics of HR. So that's the first stage, and resolving that pushes you into phase 2, which is growth through direction. And here, this is all about, they've added those additional leaders and they're starting to get their sections of the organization in order. And while that's happening, the organization continues to develop new products and services. So here, things are operating smoothly for a while. And when I say a while, it depends on how fast the org is growing. So in a slow moving org that's adding headcount very slowly, you could spend years to decades in a phase. If you're a fast growing startup where you're literally adding hundreds of employees or thousands of employees over a short period of time, you're going to be going through these phases much faster, and you could be spending months in a phase as opposed to decades. So you can kind of think about the size of the org is what kind of accelerates you through them. But here in phase 2, things are kind of going along smoothly, but the crisis point that happens is that the scale of the offerings that the company is building gets too big for the leaders to monitor. So they start to be able to not have their finger on the pulse of everything. And this takes you to the crisis point of autonomy, and where you need to start to delegate authority. So as you start to do that, that shoves you into phase 3. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't put my little bullets up here. I'm so used to talking about it without having those on the screen that I forgot to animate them for you. So as you resolve this crisis point, it shoves you into phase 3. And phase 3 is about delegation. Okay, so what happens here is this is where you start to add the layers of a hierarchy. Instead of just having a director, you might have an associate director and an assistant director. It's really where you're building out that middle management of the organization. And that allows the top executives, your senior leaders, to turn their focus to the long-term strategy of the organization and be looking toward its future and not so much involved in the day-to-day tactical stuff. But I have to say, this stage early on is very messy. And it's messy for a couple reasons. One is those new, middle managers that have been brought on may not be yet skilled or experienced enough to take the reins, or the executives are not comfortable with letting go. So they stay overly involved and they're micromanaging the heck out of everybody underneath them. So the beginning part of this stage is messy, but eventually everyone kind of finds their spot. And then you again settle into a period of time where things are operating smoothly and the org is doing well. And again, that can be months to decades, depending on how fast you're adding people. But ultimately, what happens is you get to this next crisis point, and that has to do with the size of the organization, because it's continued to get bigger, is stressing the current policies and channels of communication. And what happens is that this just creates chaos. You start to have different parts of the organization are doing things differently, and that's causing problems. So this is where you start to notice, gosh, they're managing their budget differently in engineering than they are over in sales. Or gosh, people are doing performance reviews differently across the organization, and that's causing problems. So the sheer volume means that the organization is not, the managers can't control all those pieces in a consistent way. So that shows you into phase 4. Phase 4 is growth through coordination and monitoring. And this, at the first part of this stage, and let me tell you, this is where talent pros and HR particularly, anyone kind of in the operations area, starts to have more influence. So it's kind of like, we may have been advising the org for a while, but finally things get so messy that they're like, okay, you can go ahead and create, or stabilize the performance management system, or yes, you can implement some real clear budget controls. So this is where operations kind of gets turned loose. And on one level, it's good for the organization. It definitely brings about, some more clarity and allows things to get more aligned. But there's also the employees and the leaders who like phases 1 through 3 hate phase 4. This is where they feel like everything is getting too bureaucratic and operations is ruining everything. So this is an uncomfortable phase, particularly for talent pros, because we're trying to do some good, but it's not often appreciated. And what happens here is just HQ in general is responding with putting policies in place for everything and adding new systems and procedures and having formalized communications. These are all good for the overall efficiency of the organization. But for employees who tend to like those early phases, you can start to see some turnover or some attrition here. And that's the other thing I'd like to say is that with this model, it gave me an appreciation for like, oh, wait, we actually have people who prefer certain phases. And some people are going to be great in certain phases, and they're going to not want to stay around for other phases. But the good news is there's other talent elsewhere who loves the phase you're moving into. So it's an opportunity to go recruit them and bring them in. I do want to give you one warning about this phase, which is at first the policies and procedures are good for the organization and they bring some nice scaffolding of alignment and stability. And it's funny that Greiner found this, but it seems like no org can resist the temptation to not overdo it. So what happens is the tipping point comes where instead of creating policies that just kind of better align people, folks start to go after the lowest common denominator. And by that, I mean, 98% of your people are using the corporate credit card correctly, and a couple bozos do something stupid. Well, now there's a policy to contain the bozos, right? Or most of your people are really well behaved, showing up on time, using their vacation appropriately. There's a couple abusers, and now a policy is made to contain the abusers. And what happens is, by trying to go after the lowest common denominator, every organization hits this crisis point of red tape, where literally the policies have gotten too intense and they're actually binding the organization and preventing people from doing the work they need to do. And senior executives in particular get really frustrated with this. And that's where you start to get your leaders and other functions saying, you know, HR, the talent people are slowing down our hiring process, or they're making it impossible for us to get our work done because we just have too many policies. So this seems to be a natural part of the evolution, but I'm hoping, you know, if I give more people this tool, somehow we'll have an org that finds that sweet spot and doesn't overdo it. But inevitably, even when we do overdo it, the system self-corrects. So the next phase is phase 5. It's called growth through collaboration. And what happens is the bureaucracy gets so binding that ultimately the org has to solve that. And so what they do is they move into this new culture where they want to say, okay, we're not going to handle everything with red tape. We're going to focus on hiring emotionally intelligent people and empowering and trusting them to make good decisions. And we're going to have agile and flexible systems so that people can get their work done quickly. But let me tell you, most orgs come to this after they've lost a lot of business or have had a major crisis in their revenue or in their employee size or something. So usually they come to this awareness after pretty big challenges. But what happens here is that the organization gets more flexible things in place, and that's great. And you can hang out in this phase for a long time. Again, it depends on how fast you're growing. But ultimately, what pushes you into the last phase is that the organization hits the end of its natural organic growth, and it can only continue to grow by partnering with other organizations. And so that shoves you into phase 6, which is growth through alliances. And here it's really about, partnering with other orgs. So oftentimes this looks like mergers and acquisitions, franchises, outsourcing major elements of the business. So the org, in order to continue its growth trajectory, has to start involving more and more other orgs. Now, let me just be clear. You can do some of those behaviors in earlier phases, like oftentimes we outsource certain things to services. And that's more now that we have technology-driven services. But just in general, it really means that the org has to start doing more things like franchises or M&As in order to reach the bigger market share. And ultimately what happens over here is that as you bring in other employees from other companies, as you're merging with other organizations, the core mission gets diluted because it's merging with other missions and other values and vision. So it brings you to the crisis point of identity where the org, and particularly the leaders, feel committed to, gosh, we need to really refocus on what we're about. What is our vision, our mission, and our values, and what is our strategy? So those are the 6 phases that Greiner identified. And what I have found is that they give me a real crystal ball. I can walk into an organization and just ask a few questions, and I know exactly what phase they're in. And I think what's most important is, yeah, you want to know what phase you're in, but most important, you want to know what crisis point is coming and what's your next phase. Because as talent pros, we should be preparing for that. We should be proactively getting ready for the crisis point and proactively getting ready for the next phase so that our employees are ready and they're prepared and they have the skills they need. What most orgs do is they kind of have the crisis point happen first, and then they're reacting and trying to fix it on the backside. So you want to be ahead of the curve. So now that I've given kind of you the 101, and here's the handout you have, which gives you kind of the cliff notes on it. We have a poll question for you, which is, where is your organization? So think about the Greiner curve, and what we want you to do is identify where you think the core part of your business is, your organization right now. What phase do you think you're in? So we'll give you a minute to answer that. It is possible that parts of your business, the core part of the business, is in a further along phase than maybe new functions that you've added. So think about the core part of the business. What phase are they in?
And Britt, while we're waiting, we've got a question from Linda. She'd like to know, how do you apply the phases of growth when you are working in what she would describe a startup legacy company, or as a startup in a legacy company?
So companies do that, right? They'll start a new little division or a new little function, or when you do an M&A, right, you can have a company that is a long-standing company at a certain phase and you've just acquired a company that's at a younger phase. Absolutely, that creates a little chaos. So what happens when you're a startup within the legacy, you're going to still have many of those behaviors. You're still going to start at phase one, essentially, of the Griner curve, but you're going to be influenced by the larger organization. So you're going to see some of those policies and procedures influencing you early on instead of them getting developed organically. So you're going to be a little bit of a hybrid. All right, so let's see. We have most of you 25, well, no, most of you are sitting in phase 5, 28%. Next largest group is coordination and monitoring. And very few, I'm not surprised that hardly any of you are in phase 1 because it's very rare for talent pros to be in that part of the org anyway. Okay, great. It's good for you to know this. How I use this tool with executives is I teach them the Griner curve, and I also have them start to assess where they are in their organization. And we talk about what are the likely crisis points, what does that start to look like. But what I have found is when I start to give them some of this information, and I don't always give them Griner right away. I ask questions and I start to say, oh, so you're probably experiencing this and that and this and that. And they'll be like, oh my gosh, how did you know? And then after I've kind of gotten the benefits of my expertise that I've brought to the conversation, then I give them this tool and we use this tool together. And I have found it's been a game changer because then you're all working together around what's coming and how do we solve it. And it gives them just a real clear understanding of like, oh, we are actually growing as an org, and that's going to mean things. It means a couple things in particular. You know, every growth phase shapes the employee life cycle. It shapes what your org structure and design is going to look like. And it also shapes the roles and goals of the talent professionals and what they're doing, and also what skills are needed. So it can really help you start to predict like when you're going to lose talent, where you can start going to recruit new talent. You actually want to be recruiting talent from organizations that are in a further along phase than you are, so that you can bring that experience and wisdom into your org. You can also know that right when you go from phase 3 to phase 4, you'll probably see some attrition. And then if you could predict that, then nobody's panicked by it. And in addition, in terms of the skill development, we really want to think about, you know, what makes someone great in phase 2 might not make them great in phase 5. So it also means that as you're looking for talent and assessing your talent, you want to be thinking about how does that map to the phases, because what makes a great leader or a great manager or a great employee at phase 2 is different than phase 5. So it may mean that you're going to be changing out who you're recruiting and putting in these positions, or making sure that your L&D department is developing them into the next phase. If you're not developing them ahead of the time of you getting there, you're going to have a bunch of employees that are not ready, and they're not going to be able to lead and perform in the organization. So your L&D strategy and your recruiting strategy should absolutely map to Griner. If you want one more cool tool to look at this, particularly for those of you in fast-growing startups, Reid Hoffman, he was the founder of LinkedIn. He teaches a Stanford University course, and it's available. All the classes are available on YouTube. It's called blitzscaling. And it's a particular strategy that, particularly in technology, the leaders use to grow the organization fast because they're trying to get to the IPO. And while it works, it's hell on talent professionals. and the impact of talent isn't always in the mix. So for those of you in fast growing companies, I encourage you to watch this course, because it's just going to give you some new information about kind of how to navigate executive goals and challenges. All right, so that's our first tool. I now want to move us on to our second tool, which is consulting for impact. Now, you're probably already consulting. You're having lots of conversations in your organization. You're having those meetings. You're developing those relationships. But I want to give you some specific ways to do that, particularly with your executives, but also with any of your major influential leaders and even your day-to-day managers. Consulting for impact is going to be a tool that helps. So again, across your organization, there's probably going to be different functions, right? And on one level, oh, my font made these all break in a funny place. We'll ignore that. It's supposed to look pretty, but it's a little wonky. What we do know is that, Greiner tells us that there is some commonalities across the organization, and you'll see that. But we also know that everyone who works in these different functions thinks they're very special. So sales will tell you our world is very, very different than engineering. And they're right on some level, right? There is some differences. And so part of consulting is really getting to know that function so that the leader of that function feels like you really get their world. And then you can start brainstorming and helping them solve problems from a place of trust, as opposed to them feeling like they always have to tell you that you don't know what you're doing or you don't get their world. And that comes to the surface a lot as you make that transition from phase 3 to phase 4, is that they feel like these policies are putting carte blanche over everyone the same and aren't acknowledging the differences that exist between a sales culture, for example, and the culture in facilities. And so I find that being able to kind of map these consulting questions on top of Greiner helps me hit the target better. And when we're looking at consulting for impact, there's 3 things you need to be doing. One is you got to do your homework. Right? When you're going in to meet with the executive of sales, you got to do a little research here around what's happening. What data do you have at your fingertips? Do they have high turnover? What are their engagement scores? Read the profile of the leader on LinkedIn. Think about what you've heard him or her say in meetings. What are their values? What do they seem to care about? You got to do your homework so that you go in informed, right? You don't want to go in cold turkey. You also want to be thinking strategically. So part of how you bring value to the business is always thinking about, what can I see that is going on that I can be helpful with? So Greiner is certainly part of that, kind of looking ahead, paying attention to what's happening in the industry, even just connecting the dots. Like maybe you hear something's bubbling up in facilities and you think it might have an impact on sales, mention it, because they may not have connected those dots. So that's how you can be, again, consulting for impact. And the one we're going to do a deeper dive in here is asking the right questions. I can't tell you how important it is to ask the right questions. And I had a part of my career where I was just your basic professional. And then I went through a coaching certification program where I was given a set of tools, and particularly they're about asking the right questions, that completely changed how I operated. So what I want to share with you today is some of those highlights. But when you're asking the right questions, here's the benefits of it. First of all, the executive or the leader you're talking to is going to feel really heard. And they're also going to see that you're harnessing their wisdom and experience. They're going to feel like you're honoring or respecting what they bring to the table, and they're going to feel like you're really hearing them. This is going to build your rapport and your trust with that person faster than anything else I know of. In addition, as you guys talk, what you're going to do is uncover the real issues, not the one you thought you were talking about, but the real stuff underneath it surfaces. And that allows you to solve the challenges more quickly and effectively. You're actually, whatever you're going to roll out is going to do the job, as opposed to, oh, it didn't really solve the problem. So what we're going to do is, I built this case study for a course that I have on LinkedIn, and then they also put it into the 2017 Workplace Learning Report. So if you want to see it, I've actually excerpted a couple pages here that you can still get that online somewhere. But it's a real case between John and Maria. This happens to be within a certain department, but it doesn't really matter. The same conversation plays out in any kind of department and in any type of organization. So what we have here is, we see that John and Maria both work for this large global hospitality company. And although this discussion can apply anywhere, it's playing out in this conversation. So John is going to be like calling up Maria. She's in a talent function, particularly learning and development, and say, hey, I need a workshop or training on communication. We got to put 30 people through it. before the quarter ends. And in the old way, before having great questions, Maria might say, great, I've got a workshop and I've got these dates and we'll deliver it. And so they're going to get off the phone thinking that they've solved the problem. But what's really going to happen here is that John has misidentified that it's a communication issue. So while the training might have been great, it's not going to solve the real problem he was calling about. He just didn't know it yet. So when Maria is doing a great job consulting, she's going to do some things differently. He's going to call with the same question. She's going to say, great, I'm here to help you, but can we get into some of the details here so that I can ask better questions and learn more about what is going on? So he's going to say what the problem is, and she's going to start following up with, and I'm sorry, my glasses are giving me a problem right now. Sarah, is that less blurry for you, or is it blurry for everybody?
It is a bit blurry, but I'm wondering if it's just small. I'm not sure.
It is just small, but I don't have a way to increase it on my screen. Do you?
Me either.
Okay. If I change, hang on, I'm going to open it up. I'm going to open up the original on my document. We're sending this to you, so you'll have this. So don't worry about that. Let me just open up the original on my screen, and then I can blow it up as big as I need to. Sorry.
The audience is saying it's blurry for them as well. So yeah, we apologize for that.
Yep. Okay, we'll fix that. Give me a second to find it. Okay, here it is.
I also zoomed in on the screen a bit on my end, and it helped to be able to see those conversation points just for anybody that's, interested in doing that as well.
Okay. Good. Well, I'll be able to read them now. Sorry about that. All of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, that is not projecting in a way that my eyes can read. Okay, so when we get to this conversation, now, Maria's asking a few questions. So her first question is just tell me what's happening right now. So we get away from his interpretation that it's communication. And he says, well, the team is missing key deadlines and some projects have gone out with errors that someone should have caught. And she asks, is everyone on the marketing team involved? And he says, no, it's actually a coordination between the content team and the social media group, 10 people total. Right now, they either miss the deadlines and get it right, or we get it out the door, but we find errors. So already that's some valuable information, right? We've focused in on who's involved and what's really going on. The conversation continues. And Maria says, okay, what would it look like if people were performing optimally? I always love to ask that question because when they can tell me the desired state, it reveals some more stuff. So he says, well, we would follow the project plan to the letter, we would make our deadlines, and things would be error-free. And then she starts to hone in, okay, when you think about these 10 people, what skills do they need to make the shift? Is there gaps? Is there anyone doing this well? And I always love to ask the question, who's doing it right? Because it gives more information. And he says, well, actually, yes. I think we need better time management and error checking. And these two people, Kelly and Abdi, are my top performers. Well, what are they doing differently than the rest of the group? So again, we're getting some more information here. And he says, well, they've been here the longest. I wonder if they've come up with helpful strategies. So now we've revealed that there are some people who are doing it well and that they might have some information we can harness. So Maria continues the conversation by saying, all right, that's a great question. Let's connect with them and see what insights they can provide. Using what they share, let's do a focus training for these 10 people around executing the project plan and adding some elements of time management and quality control. And John says, that sounds great. So by just asking a few questions, you've now really honed in on what the real problem is, who's really involved, and you've got some key internal experts that you can leverage. That's going to be a very different workshop and a very different result than if you had just done your basic 90-minute communication training. So the questions that I love to ask, we're going to give them to you. We turned this into kind of a follow along thing, but you can take this sheet into any meeting and mix up the questions, and whatever you think is relevant, and feel free to add your own. But I found that by asking the right questions early on in the relationship, the person feels really heard, we get to the real meat of the issue, and I can do a better job now hitting the target. And obviously, as you're asking these questions, elements of Grindr are going to come into the mix, right? So don't be surprised if some of the issues that come up also reveal some stuff with Grindr, or you're bringing some of the Grindr influence to the conversation. And consulting with impact is just something that we all need to get good at. So I'd love to have another audience share question here at this moment, which is, what are some of your favorite tips for consulting with business leaders? Or if you got a particularly challenging situation that you're currently dealing with, feel free to ask me or the group about it. So take a minute to put those in. We're going to read a few of them right now, and then I'll do more at the end.
And you can respond either on screen or via the group chat or Q&A, anything that's most comfortable for you.
Yeah, group chat, everyone will see. Q&A is more private. And thank you for your patience while I realized that I couldn't read what I put on the screen. Okay, Sarah, do you want to start reading some out loud?
I'm not seeing any coming in quite yet.
Okay.
I might still be typing. Okay, there's a few that have come in now. First and foremost is dealing with, this is a challenging situation, and talking about multiple generations in the workforce, both young people that are needing more and older folks that are needing more, yet it's in different styles.
Yeah, so, when I'm working with any executive, I try to match what they need. So depending on what their values are, their communication style, I try to make myself malleable so that that person feels really seen and heard by me. And I will have a slightly different relationship with each senior leader, but they will all feel like they're getting good service and good input from me. So I definitely flex when I've got a younger leader versus a wiser, older leader. And then also, they also have their personalities, right? Some are brusque and grumpy, and some are really chatty and want to know lots of information. So I think part of being a good consultant is making sure you're malleable and that you're shifting or changing to meet the needs of the person you're trying to influence and be influenced by.
I really like a suggestion is to always try to get to the root cause of the issue, which I think is just so helpful both professionally and personally. Absolutely. We can spend a lot of time moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic, but really the problem is the the iceberg that punched a hole in it. Another challenge here, we'll take a couple more, is why not getting buy-in easily. So struggling to put forth an idea, but having to feel to go overboard and trying to convince, folks to give buy-in. Fantastic. My next tool is going to help a lot with that. But really, you have to translate whatever you're trying to get buy-in into the issues that matter most to them. So whether that's bottom line costs, whether that's efficiency, there's something that matters to each of your executives. For some of them, it's their ego and wanting to look good. So it's really about positioning that issue to merge or align with something that matters to them. That's the way you get buy-in. Trying to convince them to see the value in something that really isn't on their radar you can spend a lot of time doing that and it just won't work. I love that. And I think it ties directly into the tip that we'll move on from, but to be humble and not a know-it-all, but also at the same time, firm with your convictions of the correct direction for an organization. Michael, I really like that. Absolutely. And Michael, I think that works best when you've spent that time building the trust so that they know that you hear them and see them and you've offered some valuable things. Once you have that relationship in place, then you can absolutely say, look, I need you to listen. I think this is a crisis, or I really am standing firmly that this is our top priority this year. And once you've earned that respect, they'll stop and listen. But if you try to
if you try to do that too early in the relationship, it won't necessarily land. Great suggestions, everyone. I appreciate all that. Let me move on to our third tool, and this is what's going to give us a few more goodies here. And this is the one that honestly shocked me the most. Like when you go into an organization, they all have things, the executives all have things that they want to work on. And generally they want more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff. And I always thought that the talent implications for some of these issues was clear, right? Like they would get it. But what I found is they didn't. Like, I can't tell you how many times, I've tried to explain engagement to executives and why it matters. And for many of them, they're like, I don't care. So what I have found is that I have to spend a lot of my time translating talent issues into metrics that matter for those executives. So I've had to learn how to speak their language. And sometimes it's speaking 10 different languages because each executive really cares about something differently. But this is how you're going to get talent issues on their radar. Is really turning them into something that matters. So let's take engagement an example, because I know it's something that we all talk about, right? And we've all seen the data on what Gallup has found. This is their most recent report and what the numbers are for the United States. And I have definitely been in conversations with executives where I'm like, we really need to, work on our engagement, and they just don't quite get it. And so I've even shared this other statistic, like, hey, disengaged employees cost an organization $3,400 for every $10,000 of salary. And I'll think, wow, they're going to have the aha moment. And even then they didn't get it. So I finally realized, oh my gosh, I literally have to break this down. I have to do the math for them so that they see it. And I didn't expect to have to do that so much with senior executives, but I have found now that I've embraced that it's become a really great tool for me. So one of the things I want to empower you to do is when you find a statistic like this one on the screen, is instead of just putting it up there by itself, is actually create the follow-up chart, which turns it into math. So here's what I've done. I've gone into organizations and I've done this chart with companies that have over 10,000 employees, and I've broken it down by division. And whenever I do the math, they're floored. But let's just take an example of a company that's 500 employees. If we take the US average of 16% who are actively disengaged, that's 80 people. Okay. And if our median salary, and I would get these numbers directly from HR, so I'm using real numbers from that company, but let's say in this company, the median salary is $75,000. Well, I know that 34% of salary is the cost of disengagement. So it's $25,500 per disengaged employee per year. And when I add that up, this company is losing over $2 million for the costs of disengagement. Now, costs of disengagement include them not working at full capacity, them doing harm to the culture, them driving turnover of other people, stealing the chips and clips, all the stuff that's kind of in what disengaged employees do. I have yet to meet an executive who isn't floored when I do this chart. And I've gone into companies where they have quote unquote awesome cultures. So if I'm talking to that kind of group, I'll say, hey, you guys are awesome. So let's say it's half of this number. Let's say it's a third of this number. It's still a hell of a lot of money. And all of a sudden they go, oh, okay, this is why it matters. And so we just talk about if we shifted this number by even 3%, what is your savings? And that's oftentimes where I will then get the budget. I'll say, hey, I will shift this number by 3%. That equals X, whatever the math is on that. And I need part of that. Give me a pilot project. Let me have a little budget to do it. Let's even pick one division to do it in. And if I move the numbers there, you'll let me roll it out everywhere else. So doing the math. Here's another one I do the math on all the time. So executives can get a little laissez-faire about attrition or turnover. I literally had one CEO say to me, well, screw them if they don't want to work here. We'll just hire someone else. And I was trying to talk to her about some problems we were having with high turnover. And she was like, I don't care if they leave. And I was a little shocked because what she didn't understand was this number, how much it costs to replace an employee who leaves. And SHRM has done some research that says it's 50 to 250% of salary plus benefits. Okay, so this includes the lost productivity while the position is unfilled, the cost of often onboarding, recruiting, hiring, training, and the time it takes for the new person to get up and running. And so I'll do some math again. I'll say, all right, let's take an entry-level employee that's making 50,000, and we'll use that 50% number. And let's take one of our higher level technical leaders, our technical skilled or higher level leaders, and that's 250%. And that's salary plus benefits, right? So you're not just looking at annual salary. And when I show them the math to replace an employee, and here's what's even better, if you now multiply this by the number of people you've lost in the last 6 months or in the last year, the number gets pretty high and pretty shocking. So I have found that doing the math really helps them start to see, oh, we actually need to care about attracting and keeping that top talent, because when we let someone leave, it's not just, affecting our efficiency, it actually has real costs to it. What's great about the engagement data is you can actually calculate it for anywhere in the world, because Gallup has their global report that actually has engagement numbers for every region, including they get country specific. So I've gone in and run, reports and put together presentations that show what our disengagement issues are costing us in our China office or in our London office. And so you can get pretty specific with this. And what's great is a lot of these things, you can certainly calculate into US dollars, but they work for every currency. So percentages can be translated to euros or yen or rupees or whatever country that you're trying to make the case for. Now, certainly engagement and turnover are some issues, but here's some other things you might want to consider calculating or turning into a mind-blowing presentation based on what matters to your executives. So customer service, right? How can we look at what the impression is of our company, what kind of loyalty we have, what kind of complaints or returns we get? Creativity, how creative is your organization? How much is your teams coming up with new ideas, doing risk-taking, engaging in collaboration? There's ways to measure this, right? And you want to start to look at what kind of data can I get my hands on? Development, are we developing people's capabilities? How are people performing? What kind of promotions are people getting? How many people are requesting to transfer out of certain departments or under certain leaders? Culture, again, what kind of turnover do you have? What kind of absenteeism rates? What kind of engagement scores do you have? These are all things that you can pull data on and start to build a case. I wouldn't recommend going after all of them, but you want to hone in on the ones that A, matter to your executives, and B, you can find data on. There's also some hard data, so you can actually look at your overhead costs, your operating costs, costs of accidents, sales. You can look at output numbers, how many things your company is pushing out the door, whether that's students graduated or grants awarded or accounts signed. The measurement is different depending on your business. You can look at how much time is being used. Time translates to money, so you can measure time. You can measure quality in terms of the quality of the product or the problems with that. And you can also measure energy, right? What are your costs with water or land, or how much pollution or waste is your organization generating? So cast your net wide, but make your choices based on what matters to your executives. And ultimately, what you're doing is you're translating business sense into business sense, right? So you want to ask the question, what problem are we trying to solve? What can we measure? How could we measure progress so that if I institute a solution, we can see that we've made a difference? Who are the stakeholders and what expectations do they have? If you ask those questions up front, you'll start to hone in what you want to work on. And then I also like to get clear about, are we increasing something or decreasing something? So you could be trying to increase productivity, or you could be going after decreasing inefficiency. Both will get you some awesome results. Are you increasing retention or decreasing attrition, right? They're the same thing, but you might come at them slightly differently. Are you increasing revenue or decreasing waste? So as I'm asking those consulting questions and trying to figure out what matters to my executives, I start to hone in on which angle they like to go with. And certainly for those of you that are rolling out learning, I always like to present Jack Phillips' work on the return on investment on learning, because really, the lowest level is, did the learners like the program? The next level up is, did they actually walk away learning the content that you have to measure through assessing their knowledge? Implementation, did they actually take that learning and deploy it on the job? That you can see through observation and some other measurements. ultimately, did that shift in their behavior change what you were going after? So here's an example. If you want to decrease complaints to HR, you might implement a manager training program. So you're going to give your managers some new skills about how to be better managers, but ultimately you're going to measure, did complaints to HR go down, right? And ultimately then you can calculate, did the money that we spend on the manager training pay off in the cost of losing some of our best people when we compare those things? And then kind of the last part of demonstrating value is really being a flashlight and shining the light on some important issues that maybe your executives haven't thought about. And I like to draw their attention to valued sources that I know are doing good, solid research. So I'm always scanning kind of everyone's latest report they're putting out there, signing up for webinars, getting those white papers, getting those reports. You should have, your inbox stuffed with them, because ultimately it's going to be looking through them that you're going to be able to put together some good stuff. So here's a page from a report by Burson and Deloitte, which is really talking about how we've shifted in manager philosophy. And right now we're kind of at this transition from really focusing on teams and moving toward purpose and meaning. And so I want to share this with executives to say, hey, this is where we are as a society. I want us prepared. Let's be forward looking and think about how we can meet those needs. I might get a report like this. Deloitte puts out this global human capital trends every year. I love these reports. They are hundreds of pages, chock full of lots of great data. This is just their summary page. But what I'll do is start to look for trends. Like in this particular one, it's about diversity and inclusion. And I might use this section of the report to say, hey, this is starting to really become something we need to put some attention to. I want to make this an initiative this year, and their data will help me make that case. Or I might pick a couple trends here. If I'm wanting to get approval to purchase something like Degreed, I might then search for data that supports why that's a good purchase for us to make and what the benefits are. So what you're doing here is leveraging their staffs of researchers and their ability to collect and crunch numbers to give you some other data in addition to the data you can pull within your own organization. I'm always looking for interesting stats that I think will help my managers or my leaders understand something. I oftentimes build my own slide because I can't just take a screenshot out of the report. So I'm always looking for imagery that might be impactful. And I would just say, here's something to know. The human brain processes images 60,000 times faster than words. So when I'm picking an image, I'm mindful of that. So for example, when I'm talking about why change fails, having, a trash can conveys something very differently than if I just had a chart. So think about your imagery and how you basically build a case and even a visual story or narrative to what you're telling people. McLean & Company is another great source of reports. This one's all about the silver tsunami, and they've got some great data. So if you know that kind of a shortage in certain talent generations or talent pools is going to be an issue, again, there's lots of data you can pull from something like this. There's a couple great reports out there on wellness and the actual costs to the company of injuries and accidents. I would be pulling data here if I wanted to make the case for safety training, for us to address safety issues in the organization, or if we wanted to look at the cost of stress on our workers. There's lots of ways you could take these numbers and multiply it by your, these percentages and multiply it by your employee base, or other data you get from HR, and start to build the case from this national study to what it really means in your organization. But essentially, to demonstrate value, you're really doing the translation between some of these data points and what it really means here in this org where we do X, Y, and Z. Because I have found that just telling them the bigger data doesn't always grok for them, doesn't always translate for them into the real impact unless I do that work for them. So, little question here. I know you're already doing some great work sharing your favorite ways to demonstrate value, or you could also identify a goal for yourself, how you might use some of these tools in the coming weeks. And let's just take a couple minutes here because I want to leave time for just some Q&A at the end.
Again, go ahead and send to us via the group chat or the Q&A, and we'll share with the audience. In the meantime, though, Britt, Michael has asked if you could please repeat your comment on the brain and visuals.
Oh, so the brain processes an image 60,000 times faster than words. So my slides now are almost always an image that really conveys what I'm getting at with a few words over the top of it or along the bottom of it. You've seen some of that in this deck. So I've gotten to be much more focused on being a visual storyteller and not just handing people data. So infographics, you know, I used to do reports where I would talk about retention or attrition, and I would literally get a stick figure, and then I'd put, 100 of them on the screen, and then I would do the percentage by turning some of them a certain color. So either we've added this many employees this year or we've lost this many employees, and I would show percentages by people out of 100 on a screen. And when they see those 100 people on the screen, it conveys something different than just putting the statistic.
So we're getting some short answers, but folks are talking about financial, attrition, attention, engagement, seeing more interactivity in the learning courses. These are the things that they're sending as some of their favorite ways to demonstrate value. And then we've had questions about that they're actually struggling with this too. They're struggling with how to demonstrate after a pilot that you moved the needle at all, and or how to measure learning results more than simply asking our folks, did they enjoy the course? Those are current struggles for identifying value right now.
Okay, so I'm going to give you two books that I think you all will appreciate that will help you with this. One is by Jack Phillips, and he has a few books on the return on investment, but he has a book specifically on the return on investment around learning, and it's full of all kinds of case studies and how measurements and cases were built and how the data was collected and analyzed. So look for Jack Phillips stuff on ROI. He also has an institute where you can go learn some stuff about it. And then the other one is, it's called The 4 Disciplines of Execution, and it's by Chris Chesney. 4 Disciplines of Execution. And it really became a clear strategy for me to use in many of the orgs that I've worked with, is how to demonstrate value. So 2 of those books might give you some new tips and tricks in addition to what we've talked to today. I want to leave you with one last piece of data, which is this idea that where we are in the talent professions is we're going through these 3 parallel evolutions or revolutions, and they're being pushed by technology. So, we started off with education, which was socializing people for work. It was the ticket to the middle class, and now it equates to crushing debt. Then we moved to training. We can teach skills, improve performance, and develop leaders. And now the conversation is really about learning, this anytime, anywhere, lifelong process about developing people's potential. So make sure that you are also evolving your conversations with your leaders. A second revolution that's happening is we've gone from human resources, really this hire and fire approach, to thinking about workers and employees. This was really the age of unions, workers, employee satisfaction, and diversity. But now where we are is really talking about talent, right? We're looking at millennials, the competition for the highly skilled, the importance of engagement, inclusion, purpose, and wellness. So these are the conversations you should be pushing in your org. And then finally, in terms of management, we started with management science, which was very transactional. That was the Peter Drucker and having MBOs and KPIs. Then we moved to the social science, which was really kind of transformational leadership. Dan Goleman and emotional intelligence, all of that lived there. And now we're at this place of neuroscience and really looking at how neuroscience is coming into the conversation. So Carol Dweck, Charles Duhigg, Richard Davidson, David Rock, and this is the space I play in, is really taking what we're learning about biology and how humans are wired and how that influences us at work. So in my research, I have found, for example, that there's some specific things around the brain and what drives resistance to organizational change. So if you're interested in that, I've got a book on that. I also have training. And my newest book on teams just came out, and I found some really fascinating stuff about the brain science of collaboration and inclusion. And it really is a game changer for how we think about bringing about the best in teams. So if you have not yet started exploring the brain science angle, I found that it's an angle that has a lot of great data that is also really helpful for executives. So think about that. We're out of time, but if you post any other questions in the chat box, I will answer them and we will send them to you as a follow-up. So I want to thank you again for the time that you gave us, and I look forward to being connected. Please follow me on LinkedIn. Please check out Degreed. It's one of the services I recommend. I think it's a wonderful thing to have for your organization. And we will wrap up here, but please leave any final questions or comments you have in the chat box.
Absolutely. I'll leave the chat open for just a bit. Dr. Britt, thank you so much for incredible information today. Again, there's her contact information on the screen if you have specific questions or want to point anything out. Q&A will be open for a little bit, but otherwise I wish you all wonderful rest of the days and good weeks ahead. Thanks so much. Take care.